A flight attendant drove a fork straight through a Marine general's hand. Seconds later, his troops made the cabin run red with blood. He drove a fork through a general's hand, certain that even a soldier would stay silent. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The seatbelt sign had barely clicked off when General Colton Rourke felt the weight of eyes on him. He didn't need to look up to know the stare carried something sharper than curiosity. Years of combat had trained his instincts to pick up on the subtle shifts of hostility, stiffened air, slowed footsteps, the faint pause before a smile stretched too wide. He lifted his gaze just enough to meet the narrowed eyes of a flight attendant moving down the aisle, a man with a lean frame and a practiced grin that faltered the moment it met the polished Marine lapel pin fastened to Colton's jacket. Wyatt Kellum didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His silence was loaded, his stare lingering just long enough for Colton to catch the flicker of resentment hiding behind it. Then, just as quickly, Wyatt bent slightly, offering a polite nod to another passenger as if nothing had passed between them. But Colton knew better. He had seen that expression before, on recruits who hated authority, on men who felt the world had pushed them out of line and wanted someone else to blame. Across from him, Owen adjusted his carry-on bag beneath the seat and noticed his father's shift in posture. "Something wrong?" he asked in a low voice, trying to read Colton's rigid shoulders. Colton kept his voice steady, his tone flat but firm. "Stay sharp." Not everyone smiles for the same reason. His eyes stayed locked on the aisle, following Wyatt's back as the attendant disappeared into the forward galley. Owen leaned back, his brows furrowed, and glanced toward the window where the clouds stretched endless and pale. He wasn't used to this kind of tension. He had grown up hearing his father's stories about ambushes in desert towns, about nights spent listening for footsteps outside wire fences. But this was different. This was civilian life, a commercial flight, a world where uniforms were supposed to inspire respect, not suspicion. Still, the unease in his father's voice left him unsettled. The cabin hummed with the usual sounds of travel, the whir of engines, the soft murmur of passengers greeting one another, the metallic clink of drink carts being prepared. Yet beneath it all was a subtle crackle, like static before a storm. Colton pressed his broad shoulders against the leather seat and forced his breathing into an even rhythm. Outwardly, he looked calm, but inside, he was charting possibilities. He had lived too long to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. Danger didn't always come dressed in combat gear. Sometimes it wore a pressed uniform and carried a name tag. Wyatt returned a few minutes later, his hands full with a stack of menus. He moved smoothly from row to row, his voice polite, but his eyes, when they drifted back to Colton, burned with something darker. He placed the menu in front of Owen, then leaned a fraction closer to Colton as if sharing a private joke. "Enjoy the flight, General," he said softly. The words carried no warmth. Colton didn't reply. He simply tilted his chin, acknowledging the greeting without granting it satisfaction. Wyatt's smirk deepened before he moved on, and the tension he left behind sat heavy in the air. Owen shifted in his seat, his fists tightening on the armrests. "Why does he talk to you like that?" Owen whispered. Colton's eyes didn't leave the aisle. "Because some men spend their lives staring at doors they couldn't walk through. They blame the ones who made it inside." His tone was measured, but there was steel beneath it, the kind of steel that had carried him through firefights and negotiations alike. The father and son sat in silence for a stretch, the hum of the engines filling the space where words failed. Colton let his gaze wander over the other attendants. Most worked with the rhythm of the cabin, professional, focused. Wyatt was different. He carried himself like a man rehearsing for a confrontation, every step deliberate, every glance charged. The memory of his son's imminent deployment tugged at Colton's heart as he studied the young man beside him. This flight was supposed to be their moment, one last shared space of peace before Owen stepped into his own battles. Instead, it felt as though the war Colton thought he'd left behind was boarding the plane with him. He turned slightly, his voice dropping low enough that only Owen could hear. "When you walk into a storm, you don't wait for the lightning. You prepare for it." Owen nodded, though his jaw tightened. He understood the lesson, even if he hated its necessity. Wyatt passed by again, adjusting a passenger's tray table, his lips curved in that same unfitting smile. Colton watched the man disappear toward the galley once more, his own mind ticking through possibilities like a commander reviewing a battlefield map. The plane was 30,000 feet in the air, but the sensation in his chest told him they weren't flying into calm skies. The moment lingered, heavy and taut, as Colton finally let his head rest back against the seat. Outside the window, the horizon stretched wide and endless, but inside, the air grew tighter with every passing second. His instincts whispered what his words later confirmed. The skies were quiet, but the war was just about to begin. The glass clinked softly as Colton Rourke set it back on the tray, empty except for the melting ice cubes rattling at the bottom. He turned to the aisle and raised 2 fingers subtly, not demanding, just signaling for a refill, the way countless travelers had done before him without incident. Wyatt Kellum was slow to respond. The flight attendant stood at the end of the cabin galley folding napkins with too much force. When he finally moved, it wasn't with the efficient grace of practiced service, but with a kind of deliberate weight in each step, like he was walking uphill against a grudge he'd never let go. His smile was tight, practiced, and brittle. "What is it now?" Wyatt asked flatly, pausing beside Colton's seat, his voice just loud enough for others nearby to hear. Colton turned slightly, his tone calm but firm. "Just a refill." "Water, if it's not too much trouble." Wyatt's lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. "You got legs, don't you?" he said. The words dropped like a hammer. For a second it felt as if the air left the cabin. A woman 2 rows back lowered her magazine. An older man adjusted his headphones, suddenly alert. Owen Rourke, seated to Colton's right, froze mid-bite. Colton didn't blink. He studied Wyatt, eyes calm but unflinching. His voice remained steady. It was a request. Not a demand. Wyatt didn't answer. He walked off without another word, the cartwheel squeaking faintly as he pushed it down the aisle. Owen leaned in, his jaw clenched. "Want me to say something?" he muttered. Colton gave a slow shake of his head. "Not now," he said under his breath. "That's what he wants." Owen sat back, but his eyes never left Wyatt's retreating form. Colton, meanwhile, tried to shift his focus back to the meal in front of him, but the fork beside his plate gleamed a little too sharply under the overhead light, and the skin on the back of his neck prickled. Something about Wyatt's tone, his posture, even the way he lingered in the galley, it all pressed against Colton's instincts like a hidden tripwire just waiting for weight. The plane glided smooth above the clouds, but inside, the air felt heavy. Across the aisle, Wyatt was speaking to another crew member, tall, thin, maybe in his 20s, who nodded quickly and disappeared toward the economy section. Wyatt stayed behind, watching. A few minutes passed, then he returned. Colton looked up as Wyatt approached with a tray in hand. This time, it was different from the standard plasticware every other passenger had been served. On this tray was a full metal set, gleaming knife, spoon, and fork. Real silver service. Odd, unnecessary, out of place. Wyatt leaned down with a brightness that didn't reach his eyes. "Brought something special for the hero," he said cheerfully. Colton's gaze dropped to the tray. The fork, longer than normal. The prongs sharper, too sharp. He forced a polite nod. "Appreciated." Wyatt didn't move. He hovered there, letting the words hang between them like smoke. "Can't have a Marine using plastic, right?" he added, his tone dripping with a mock admiration that barely disguised the scorn beneath. Colton kept his eyes steady. "As long as it gets the job done." Wyatt's smile flickered, then dropped. He stepped back, pushing the tray into place with a little too much force before turning away. Colton waited a beat, then reached for the fork, holding it delicately in his right hand. The edge glinted, clean, sterile, and undeniably military issue. He turned at once, feeling its balance, the weight too familiar. Owen noticed. "Dad?" Colton set the fork down slowly and leaned back. "Don't worry. Just stay aware." Owen sat straighter in his seat. Around them, the rest of the cabin settled into quiet hums, pages turning, light snores, the occasional clink of ice against glass. But Colton could feel the tension coil again, this time buried deeper. Wyatt's footsteps faded toward the galley, but the presence, his intent, had already been planted like a landmine. Colton glanced at the closed curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. The quiet suddenly seemed less peaceful and more staged. His fingers tapped twice against the armrest, an old signal from field ops. It meant, "Something's wrong. Don't react yet." Owen saw it. He nodded slightly. Colton exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the reflective plastic of the window, just enough to catch Wyatt's figure pausing behind him once again. "You ever feel a storm building and know it ain't weather?" The attack came like a lightning strike, fast, sudden, violent. As Colton reached for his drink, the gleam of polished metal flashed in the corner of his vision. In a single, fluid motion, Wyatt lunged forward from the aisle, his arm slicing through the air with surgical precision. The sharpened dinner fork, previously nestled harmlessly on the tray, now became a weapon. It drove through the soft tissue of Colton's left hand, the prongs puncturing flesh and slamming down into the plastic tray with a hollow crack. A sharp jolt of agony surged up Colton's arm. Blood burst from the wound in vivid arcs, splattering across the white napkin, the tray, and the front of his neatly pressed khaki slacks. The pain was immense, but Colton didn't scream. He grunted, a low, guttural sound forced through clenched teeth, but his jaw stayed tight, his eyes narrowed. Years of battlefield conditioning surged to the surface. He refused to show weakness. He would not give Wyatt the satisfaction. Gasps rang out like dominoes falling through the cabin. A woman screamed. A tray clattered to the floor in the row behind. Somewhere in the back, someone yelled for help. The soft hum of the plane's engine suddenly felt distant, muted beneath the rising chaos. Oxygen seemed thinner. Fear filled the air now. Owen reacted before he could even think. With a roar, he launched himself across the narrow space, grabbing Wyatt by the collar of his flight uniform and yanking him backward with force. The tray clattered as Colton's pinned hand was torn free, the fork still embedded. Blood streamed down his arm. Owen slammed Wyatt into the floor of the aisle, pinning his shoulders down with his knees. His fists trembled, ready to strike. "You just attacked a Marine general," Owen shouted, his voice raw with fury. His eyes burned with rage. He wanted to break every bone in Wyatt's body, but his father's voice echoed in his mind, steady and composed, always warning against blind retaliation. A younger flight attendant rushed forward, his eyes wide with panic. "What are you doing? Let him go." "Stay back," Owen barked, not taking his eyes off Wyatt. Wyatt, pinned beneath Owen's weight, laughed, a dry, bitter sound that cut through the noise like a blade. Blood stained his teeth, not from injury but from biting his cheek during the scuffle. His voice came out low and venomous. "This is what they should have done to you overseas." Colton froze. His vision blurred for a moment, not from the pain, but from the weight of those words. Overseas. They. This wasn't a random outburst. This wasn't about airline protocol or an angry flight attendant snapping under pressure. This was personal. Colton's hand pulsed with pain. Blood continued to drip from his fingers, soaking into the fabric of his pants, pooling quietly beneath his boots. A paramedic wasn't here yet. No air marshal had stepped in. The cabin crew seemed frozen, torn between protocol and fear. None of them trained for this kind of violence. And Wyatt, even restrained, was still grinning. One of the passengers in the back stood up with a phone in his hand. "I got the whole thing. I filmed everything," he shouted. Colton lifted his head slightly, catching the man's eye. He nodded. "Good. Evidence." The pilot's voice broke through the intercom, shaky but composed. "This is Captain Rosner. We've declared an emergency and are rerouting to the nearest secure airport. Please remain in your seats." Colton leaned back against the seat, cradling his wounded hand, and glanced at Owen, who was still hovering protectively over Wyatt. "Check my belt," Colton muttered through clenched teeth. Owen looked down and saw a small trauma kit clipped under the waistband of his father's blazer. He quickly pulled it free, his hands moving fast and practiced. He applied gauze over the fork and wrapped the hand with trembling fingers. His eyes welled, but he blinked the tears away. His father hadn't cried. He wouldn't either. "Why didn't you block him?" Owen asked softly. Colton's voice was quiet, heavy. "Because I didn't expect an enemy wearing a name tag and apron." Wyatt chuckled again beneath them. "Still think you're the hero?" he spat. "You wore that badge and acted like you were better than everyone." "But someone had to remind you what you left behind," Owen gritted his teeth. "You're lucky I'm not like you." Wyatt looked up with bloodshot eyes and smiled wider. "You're just not broken yet." At that moment, Colton saw it. Wyatt wasn't just bitter, he was poisoned by something deeper. Hatred, yes, but not just of Colton, of everything Colton represented. Discipline, honor, brotherhood. Things Wyatt had been denied or destroyed through his own choices. And now, he had turned that failure into a mission. A slow realization spread across Colton's face. This wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. He locked eyes with Wyatt. You don't understand what you just started." Wyatt's smirk faltered, just for a second. Across the cabin, murmurs grew louder as passengers began whispering to each other, watching with stunned eyes as Owen finally released Wyatt into the hands of two trembling flight attendants who rushed forward with zip ties. One of them clipped Wyatt's wrists behind his back, their hands shaking. Colton winced as Owen tightened the last wrap of gauze around his palm. The bleeding was slowing, but the pain throbbed deep. Not just the physical wound, but the message behind it. The rest of the flight passed in silence, except for the soft sobbing of a few passengers and the occasional metallic ping of the intercom. Colton sat upright, back straight, eyes closed, breathing evenly. Not because he was at peace, but because he was preparing for what came next. And somewhere in the dim light of the cabin, Wyatt sat on the floor, zip-tied and bruised, humming a tune only he recognized, still grinning like he hadn't lost anything. But Colton knew better. The cabin wasn't flying anymore. It was falling into something much darker. The moment the fork pierced Colton Rourke's hand, time shattered into fragments. Blood spilled fast, staining the tray table and soaking into his slacks, but the general didn't scream. He clenched his jaw, breathing through the pain as years of battlefield instinct took control. Across from him, Owen tore off his hoodie and pressed it down on the wound, panic flickering behind his eyes but kept in check by the urgency of the moment. "Stay with me, Dad." "You're okay. I've got you," Owen said, voice tight with fear but steady. The cockpit door clicked open moments later. The pilot's voice, calm but clipped, echoed over the intercom. "This is Captain Harris. We're making an emergency descent to Briar Hill Military Outpost. All passengers remain seated. Medical response will be waiting on the ground." In first class, chaos rippled quietly. The passenger across the aisle, a wiry man in a gray business suit, held up his phone, already recording. "It's already up," he muttered, fingers trembling as he uploaded the clip of the assault. Within seconds, the video began spreading, first to a private group, then to a public forum tagged with keywords that would ignite the algorithm like dry grass catching flame, and somewhere far away, in a room without windows, a desk phone lit up blue. In a former satellite communication bunker buried beneath the hills of Langham County, a red light blinked on a secure monitor. The message was short, clipped, and coded. Rourke, 787. Hit. The men inside didn't ask questions. They moved, lockers slammed open, gear bags were pulled, radios crackled with terse orders. These weren't just men, they were Ghost Lance, veterans of quiet wars, forgotten missions, and loyalties forged in fire. Sergeant Vale stood at the center of it all, his beard streaked with gray and a long scar bisecting his jawline. He watched the video once, eyes narrowing at the smirking flight attendant, Wyatt Kellum. The blood, the tray, the fork. Vale nodded once. "Mobilize the grid. Flight path confirms emergency landing at Briar Hill. We meet him on the ground." Back aboard Flight 787, Owen kept one arm braced against the tray table, his other hand holding firm pressure on Colton's wound. A younger male flight attendant hovered nearby, eyes wide. "Do something," Owen snapped. I'm trying. I've called for med." "You let him near us with that fork," Owen hissed. "You gave it to him." "I didn't know." Colton reached up with his free hand and grabbed Owen's wrist. His voice was low but firm. "Let it go." Focus, Owen bit his lip but nodded, shoulders tense. Wyatt sat zip-tied on the floor just a few feet away, still grinning through a split lip. A bruise was beginning to blossom on his temple from when Owen tackled him. "You know what the worst part is?" Wyatt muttered, voice almost a whisper. "You're still bleeding for nothing, just like before." Colton didn't answer. He didn't even look at him, but his silence was colder than any threat. 30 minutes later, the plane's tires screamed against the runway as it touched down at Briar Hill's emergency airstrip. The tarmac shimmered in the afternoon heat. Flashing lights from local base security lit the edge of the runway, casting sharp beams into the haze. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, the door cracked open and paramedics stepped aboard. "Where's the injured passenger?" one of them asked. Owen rose immediately. "Here. He's losing blood." Colton pushed himself up with effort, face pale but composed. "It's not fatal. Patch me. I'm not going out on a stretcher." The paramedic, a young man with buzzed hair and nervous hands, hesitated but complied. As he began working, Colton's eyes scanned the tarmac through the window. And that's when he saw them. 3 black SUVs pulled onto the runway, cutting off the access road to the terminal. Their windows were tinted, their movements too precise to be casual. Men stepped out in plain clothes, civilian jackets over tactical posture, boots too clean to belong to airport staff. They didn't move like police. They moved like something older, something trained. Colton exhaled slowly. They came. Owen followed his gaze and blinked in surprise. Who are they? Ghost Lance, Colton murmured. I didn't call them. But they came anyway? Colton gave a faint nod. They always do. On the ground, Sergeant Vale approached the uniformed officer attempting to escort Wyatt off the plane. He produced an old laminated badge, faded but unmistakable. The officer's hand dropped from his holster as he took a step back. This one's ours, Vale said calmly, nodding toward Wyatt, whose smirk finally faltered as he saw who was waiting for him. The officer stammered, but protocol says. Vale didn't raise his voice. Protocol stands down. He assaulted General Colton Rourke. Ghost Lance assumes custody. Faced with a name that still echoed in classified files, the officer stepped aside. Wyatt was dragged out of the patrol car and handed over without resistance. For the first time, his cocky expression began to dissolve. His eyes darted from one face to another, stone-carved men who didn't blink. One of them leaned in close and whispered something Wyatt couldn't quite hear, but it made him flinch. Owen, standing beside the paramedics as they finished wrapping Colton's hand, watched it all unfold. The weight of it hit him in waves, not just what happened, but what it meant. Loyalty. Legacy. A silent code he was only now beginning to understand. Colton didn't speak as he walked off the plane. He didn't need to. Vale met his eyes and nodded once. Not a greeting. A promise. The police backed away. The Ghost Lance vans rolled off, and Wyatt, cuffed between two quiet shadows, disappeared into the black SUV without another word. The passengers stared, hushed. The pilot stayed silent. No announcements followed, because everyone, on some level, understood. The flight had ended, but his reckoning had just begun. The patrol car rolled down the strip with its siren off, the low rumble of tires echoing across the quiet tarmac. Wyatt sat in the back seat with his wrists cuffed, grinning as if the situation were nothing more than a nuisance. He leaned his head against the window and smirked at the officer beside him. "Assault with a fork?" he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's next? A spoon rebellion?" His laughter was sharp, taunting, cutting through the tense silence of the cabin. The officer in the passenger seat gave him a wary glance but said nothing, shifting uncomfortably as if unsure whether to respond or ignore the mockery. Wyatt thrived on the silence, twisting it to fuel his bravado. The patrol car turned toward the terminal, headlights cutting across the dark stretch of asphalt. That was when the road ahead suddenly filled with shadows, 3 black SUVs parked at perfect angles, blocking the path like a barricade. Their engines hummed low, steady, and intimidating, and their tinted windows revealed nothing of the men inside. The driver hit the brakes, the patrol car shuddering as the officers exchanged nervous looks. Wyatt's grin faltered for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The doors of the SUVs opened in unison, and men stepped out with a precision that spoke of discipline earned in places no civilian could understand. Their boots hit the ground in rhythm, their faces weathered and hardened by years of war. They moved without wasted motion, each glance sharp, each breath measured. The air seemed to grow heavier as they approached, the silence carrying the weight of men who had seen and survived too much. Sergeant Vale was the first to step forward. Broad-shouldered, scarred across the cheek, his presence radiated command without needing to raise his voice. His eyes locked onto the patrol car, unwavering, until the driver reluctantly rolled down his window. Vale reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather-bound badge, edges worn, its insignia dulled with age but still carrying authority. He held it up at chest level, not thrusting it forward but steady, confident. "This man belongs to us now," Vale said, his voice low but cutting through the night with the weight of an order rather than a request. His tone held no anger, only certainty, the kind that left no room for debate. The officers hesitated. One cleared his throat, visibly torn between protocol and the instinct that told him he was standing before men who lived outside ordinary rules. "Sir, he's under custody. We're supposed to transfer him to the station for processing." His voice lacked conviction, and even he seemed to know it. Vale leaned closer, resting one scarred hand on the patrol car's roof. His posture wasn't threatening, but there was something in the quiet steadiness of his expression that made the officer's words falter. "Look at him," Vale said, nodding toward Wyatt in the back seat. "Do you really think the paperwork you'll file tonight will protect anyone from the kind of rot he carries? He belongs to men who understand what that kind of hatred becomes if left unchecked." Wyatt's smirk returned for a brief second as if to mock the gravity of Vale's words, but then it faltered again when he noticed the way the officer's resolve wavered. For the first time, his humor failed him. His jaw clenched, eyes darting between the operatives who stood behind Vale like immovable statues, silent but unyielding. The driver exhaled heavily, his grip tightening on the steering wheel before he looked away. The decision was made not in words, but in the slump of his shoulders, the quiet admission that some fights weren't his to carry. Slowly, he nodded. The back door was opened and Wyatt was pulled from the patrol car. His boots scraped against the asphalt, the chain of his cuffs rattling in the silence. The grin that had carried him this far drained from his face as Vale stepped closer, his shadow falling across Wyatt like a reminder of battles the younger man had never fought. From the tarmac, Owen watched, his chest tightening as the exchange unfolded. A paramedic knelt beside his father, tightening the bandage around Colton's wounded hand, but Owen's eyes stayed locked on the SUVs, on the men who moved with quiet loyalty. He realized in that moment that this wasn't just about punishment or even justice. It was something deeper, something that bound men like his father and Vale together in ways no courtroom or law could define. Wyatt's voice broke the silence, forced and shaky now. "You can't just take me." "I'm in police custody." He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. Vale tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he replied with calm finality. "You were theirs until now. From this moment, you're ours." The officers stepped back, surrendering not out of fear, but out of recognition. Recognition of men who carried scars not just on their bodies, but etched into their very presence. Wyatt swallowed hard, the reality of his situation dawning on him as the operatives guided him toward the waiting SUV. Owen clenched his fists, torn between anger at what had been done to his father and awe at the loyalty that still surrounded him. In that moment, he understood the bond his father had spoken of so many times, the kind of brotherhood that outlived rank, distance, and even time. As the SUVs pulled away into the darkness, leaving the patrol car idling on the strip, the night felt heavier with unspoken promises. Colton's wound throbbed, Owen's heart pounded, and Wyatt's smirk had vanished completely. The line between law and loyalty had been crossed, and nothing about the night would ever be forgotten. And sometimes the law isn't written in ink, it's written in scars. Wyatt's boots hit the concrete floor with a hollow thud as he was shoved forward, arms bound behind his back with thick industrial-grade cuffs. The blindfold was yanked off, and the sudden blaze of overhead floodlights seared into his eyes. He flinched instinctively, blinking rapidly against the sharp white glare. The room was sterile and silent, save for the faint hum of the old ventilation unit in the corner. Cold steel walls reflected the light in sharp angles. The interrogation room had no windows, no clocks, no hint of time passing, just shadows that seemed to stretch longer the more still the room remained. As his vision adjusted, Wyatt saw them. 3 men stood at the far wall, silent as statues. None of them wore uniforms, but their posture told him everything he needed to know. These weren't average enforcers. These were ghosts, men from the files he used to read in classified security briefings when he was still pretending to be something he wasn't. And in the center of them, seated behind a battered metal table, was Sergeant Vale. Vale didn't speak right away. He simply stared, his fingers folded calmly in front of him, as if he were conducting an interview, not preparing an interrogation. His eyes were gray, empty, calculating, steady. Wyatt forced a smirk onto his face, trying to reclaim control. "Is this where you scare me with silence?" Vale didn't blink. "Sit." A guard shoved Wyatt into the steel chair. The cuffs clanked against the restraints bolted into the armrests. A small red recording light blinked from the box at the center of the table. The air in the room felt like it weighed tons, as if the very walls were pressing in. "Why him?" Vale asked, his voice calm, measured, devoid of emotion. Wyatt chuckled bitterly. "Is that what this is about? You want some villain monologue? Think I'll cry and say I was just misunderstood?" "We don't care about your tears," Vale said, folding his arms. "We care about the truth." The room fell silent again. Wyatt looked around, trying to find a weak point in the faces staring back at him, but found none. They weren't angry. They weren't afraid. That was what made them dangerous. He leaned forward slightly, testing the chain tension. "You want the truth?" he asked, voice sharp now. "Fine." His expression twisted, not into rage but something more bitter. "I was 19, bright-eyed, dumb, thought I could belong somewhere. I applied for Ghost Lance, trained like my life depended on it, because it did, and when the day came, when it was time for selection, he was on the panel. He didn't need to say Colton's name. Everyone in that room already knew. I stood there," Wyatt continued, his voice growing hoarse, "and he looked right through me. Like I didn't belong? He didn't even explain it. Just one word. Unfit. That was all it took. My career, my plans, gone with a single breath. I was discharged a month later. Psychological instability, they said." Vale's face remained unreadable. Wyatt gave a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You know what happens to a man after that? No one salutes you. No one hires you. You're not a hero. You're a stain they won't scrub. I watched men less qualified wear the badge. I watched him, Colton, get promoted, awarded, honored like he was carved from stone. And me, I disappeared. A beat passed. I followed his life for years," Wyatt admitted, quieter now. "The speeches, the medals, the interviews. He wore that uniform like a badge of honor. While I was left with a name nobody saluted." Vale leaned forward for the first time. "So, you waited. You changed jobs, switched airlines, got close to men like him, officers, commanders, and you baited them." Wyatt's eyes flickered. "We found the pattern," Vale said, his voice like cold steel. "You never lashed out randomly. Always against men who stood for something. Men who testified. Men like him." Wyatt swallowed. For a moment, the smug mask cracked. "You weren't just angry," Vale said. "You were used." Wyatt flinched. "You think you came up with this plan on your own?" Vale asked. "You think a commercial flight has military-grade cutlery just lying around?" Silence. Wyatt looked down, breathing heavier now. He started, but stopped. Something in his story no longer felt stable, like even he didn't fully believe it anymore. Vale stood slowly, gathering the thin folder in front of him. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply turned to leave, pausing at the door with one final look over his shoulder. "In your eyes, Colton hadn't just been a rejection," he said quietly. "He'd been a symbol." The sound of rain tapping against the metal awning outside Briar Hill Medical was soft but constant, a background murmur to the tension inside the sterile infirmary room. Colton Rourke sat upright on the narrow hospital bed, his posture rigid despite the IV trailing from his arm and the bandaged mess that was once his left hand. The stitched skin pulsed with a dull, constant ache, but the pain wasn't what made his jaw tighten. Owen stood across the room, pacing. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white with pressure. His eyes flicked constantly toward the wall-mounted clock as though time itself was to blame for his helplessness. "I should be there," he snapped finally, spinning toward his father. "He stuck a fork through your hand, Dad." "Through your hand? And we're just sitting here while Ghost Lance deals with him?" Colton's gaze was calm but unyielding. "And what exactly would you do, Owen?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly from exhaustion but steady. "Beat him? Yell at him. That gives him what he wants. Anger wins when you let it choose your path." Owen's face twisted in frustration, but he stopped pacing. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I can't stand here and do nothing." "I'm not doing nothing," Colton said. He slowly swung his legs off the bed, wincing as the motion jostled his stitched hand. "I've been in this game too long to believe that kind of attack was random. That wasn't just rage. That was a message." The younger man frowned, confused. "A message?" Colton nodded once. "The fork he used? It was military issue, same type we used in the forward bases. They haven't been in civilian circulation for years." Owen's eyes widened slightly. "You're saying he didn't just grab it off the flight cart?" "I'm saying it didn't belong there in the first place." Colton picked up his phone with his good hand and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name. Mason Greer. He hesitated for half a second before tapping the call icon. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Colton," said the voice on the other end, deep and clipped. "Didn't expect to hear from you this soon." "I need a favor, Mason," Colton said. "It's urgent." "Go on." There was an attack. Onboard Flight 787. Guy named Wyatt Kellum. Claims he's ex-military, but something's not right. He got access to equipment he shouldn't have. I need to know who hired him, and who covered it up. There was a pause on the line. Then Mason's voice turned serious. Give me an hour. Colton hung up without another word. He leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing at the rain still streaking the windows. Something's rotten, he muttered. Owen watched him carefully. Do you think this has anything to do with your testimony? Ravenfield. The question lingered in the air like smoke. Colton didn't answer. 53 minutes later, the phone vibrated. Talk to me, Colton said as he answered. Wyatt Kellum's file is a mess, Mason said without greeting. Officially, he was hired by Central Wings 2 years ago. Background check came back clean. But when I cross-referenced his military ID, the file was redacted. Redacted by who? That's the part that's disturbing. The Defense Bureau. Redaction timestamp was from inside clearance. Someone high up scrubbed his dishonorable discharge and replaced it with a fake transfer notice. Colton's pulse quickened. Why? No idea. But here's the kicker. His airline hiring file wasn't forged by Wyatt. It was inserted using a hiring batch key assigned to an airline supervisor. Someone gave him clearance, Colton. Someone wanted him there. Colton's face hardened. The pain in his hand faded beneath a darker pressure settling into his chest. This wasn't just a man with a personal vendetta. This wasn't just about me, he said quietly. No, Mason agreed, and I don't think he chose the fork. I think he was told what to use, Owen, standing near the door, looked over in disbelief. You're saying someone orchestrated it? Like, planned the entire thing? Colton ended the call and stared at the far wall in silence for a moment. They wanted it to look personal, he said slowly, so no one would dig deeper. But they forgot one thing. Owen tilted his head. What's that? Colton looked at his son, a flicker of fire behind his eyes. They forgot who I am. He rose from the bed, steadied himself, and moved toward his coat. His left hand was wrapped in fresh gauze, but he could still move with the precision of a commander. Where are you going? Owen asked. Owen. Colton slid into his jacket without breaking stride. To call in another favor. And if this runs deeper? Colton paused at the door, his voice quiet but absolute. Then we don't just treat this as an attack. We treat it as a war. As Owen followed him down the hallway, the flicker of overhead lights seemed to echo the slow build of something larger forming beneath the surface. Somewhere inside the Defense Bureau, someone had made a decision, a quiet one, filed in shadows. But they'd chosen the wrong Marine. Colton wasn't just attacked by a man with a grudge, he was marked by a network with secrets. He thought humiliating a Marine leader mid-flight would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The flicker of fluorescent lights above the Ghostlands command room cast long shadows across a wall plastered with maps, personnel files, and red-marked photos. Vale leaned over a metal desk, his jaw tense, scanning a series of printed employment records. Mason Greer, seated beside him with a laptop glowing faint blue, tapped a few keys before stopping. There, he said, voice low but sharp. He worked 4 flights, 4 different airlines, always short-term contracts, always bounced before a year. Guess who 2 of the passengers were on flight logs during his stints? Vale looked up, eyes narrowing. Retired officers. One was a lieutenant colonel. The other, Navy commander. Both filed quiet complaints about being harassed mid-air, but the cases were buried. Owen stood silently at the far end of the room, arms crossed, his eyes dark with fury. He was hunting them, he muttered. Colton, seated across the room with his stitched hand resting in a sling, absorbed every word without a flinch. He hadn't spoken in minutes, just listening, calculating. His gaze lingered on the photos of veterans, smiling at retirement ceremonies, saluting in old fatigues, now linked to targeted humiliation. The pattern had grown too clear. Mason turned the laptop around. Look at this. Wyatt's payroll didn't come through the airline's direct system. It was routed through an offshore fund, Belize-based, hidden under layers of corporate shells. Traced it back to something called Gildan Holdings. Never heard of it, Vale said. You wouldn't. It's a ghost company, Mason replied, typing rapidly. But Gildan Holdings leads to this. He clicked, revealing a dull black and gray logo stamped on a PDF. Black Rest Solutions. Colton sat up straighter, his voice finally cutting the silence. I know that name. Mason nodded grimly. You should. They're a private ex-military contractor. Off the books. Officially dissolved 2 years ago, but clearly still active. Here's where it gets worse. They've been running low-visibility surveillance on former officers who testified during the Ravenfield hearings. The name hit like a hammer. Colton's jaw tensed. He looked to Owen, then Vale. I was one of them. Mason pulled up a redacted government PDF. Exactly. They've been following anyone who exposed procurement fraud and civilian risk cover-ups during those hearings. Quietly, silently. Through proxies, Owen's voice shook. So, this wasn't about a grudge. This was a hit. No, Colton corrected him. His voice was iron. It was a message. The realization settled over them like cold fog. Wyatt hadn't acted alone. He had been weaponized, groomed, deployed. The fork wasn't just a tool of assault. It was a symbol, a statement meant to humiliate and warn. Stay silent or bleed, Mason said, finishing the thought aloud. Vale leaned back, processing the weight of it all. Why now? Why make a move after all these years? Because I didn't stay silent, Colton replied. My name was getting loud again. This keynote at Iron Ridge, the interviews, the advisory roles, they saw it as exposure. Unfinished business. Mason glanced at the clock. And they'll move again. You weren't the last name on that list. He clicked open a hidden folder in his system. Dozens of profiles filled the screen, whistleblowers, commanders, analysts, each one marked, tracked, observed. Colton stood slowly, his stitched hand clenched slightly despite the pain. They want veterans erased, not killed outright, just humiliated, discredited, silenced. One public incident at a time, Owen stepped forward. Then we take this public, right? Media. Press Senate hearings. No, Colton said, his voice low but firm. Not yet. Not until we know the full extent. If this goes deeper, we can't afford to tip them off. We gather, we watch, we dig, Vale straightened. And when we're ready? Colton looked up at the wall, at the photos, the scars, the stories. Then we make sure no one like Wyatt ever gets deployed again. Mason hesitated. There's something else, he said quietly. Each of Wyatt's employment records? They weren't just edited, they were constructed. Someone inside the Bureau had to help plant them. That means we're not just looking at Blackrest. Colton stared ahead, his voice like gravel scraping steel. We're looking at a network. The room went silent. The magnitude of the operation had grown beyond what any of them had expected. This wasn't vengeance from a bitter man. This was organized, funded, protected. As Mason brought up satellite images of possible Blackrest holdings, Owen glanced at his father. You still want to speak at that summit? He asked. Colton's lips curled slightly, not a smile, but something colder. Now, more than ever. He turned back to the table, eyes falling on the flight manifest, the fork, the blood-stained seat photo. The air was heavy with the weight of decisions still to come. They had a plan, Vale muttered. They still do, Colton said. But they made one mistake, Mason added. What's that? Owen asked. Colton's eyes hardened. They chose the wrong Marine. The lights above buzzed faintly, and the room felt colder than before. Outside, the wind howled against the walls like a storm warning from the world itself. Because some men don't back down, they dig in. The room was silent except for the hum of overhead fluorescents and the soft shuffle of paper maps being rearranged. Colton Rourke stood motionless in front of the wall-sized board at the Ghost Lance safe house, his eyes fixed on the clustered intel pinned between thumbtacks and string. The map was a mosaic of overlapping timelines, surveillance photos, declassified memos, and satellite scans. Dozens of red circles surrounded one location, Rensford. We've confirmed movement at the site again last night, Sergeant Vale said, stepping beside Colton and pointing to a grainy photo. Unmarked trucks. No cadet rotations. Same pattern as before, only this time there's heavier security. Tripled since Wyatt's takedown, Colton didn't respond immediately. His jaw clenched. The room, filled with Ghost Lance operatives, remained quiet. No one spoke over the general when he was thinking. His eyes moved from the photo to a smaller file paperclipped to the map. It was a black and white shot of General Matthias Creed, standing at a podium with conviction in his eyes. Vale continued, voice low. "They're targeting him next." Colton exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "Creed was the first one to speak at Ravenfield," he said, his voice rough. "He took the fall so the rest of us wouldn't. If they take him out, they erase the first page of every truth we ever told." Another operator, Jensen, leaned forward from the corner. "We could go public." "Leak it all. Let the media run it." Colton turned to him, calm but sharp. "And watch the story drown in hearings and hollow press releases? Number. They'll smother it in red tape before it even surfaces." He looked back at the board. "This doesn't need noise. It needs precision." He tapped his finger on the Rensford compound. "This place isn't a training camp. It's a vault. They're stockpiling intel, uniforms, forged IDs, whatever they need to keep manufacturing attacks like Wyatt's. But more than that, it's where the silence lives." Mason Greer's voice crackled through the comm speaker on the side table. "Just ran the asset trail again. That facility's being funded through shell companies tied to Blackrest Solutions. Same offshore bank as Wyatt's payroll. Then it's confirmed," Vale muttered grimly. Colton turned to face his team. "We move at dawn." A quiet murmur spread through the room, not of dissent, but of readiness. He walked toward the equipment lockers, grabbing a mission folder and tossing it onto the table. "No uniforms. No insignia. We go in as contractors. Utility vans. Mason will forge the work order entries and scramble the security feed remotely." Vale nodded, already calculating. "EMP scramblers for cameras. Entry through the side access. No frontal breach." Owen, who had been sitting quietly at the back, suddenly stood. "I'm going." Colton froze. His shoulders stiffened. "No." Owen stepped forward. His voice didn't shake. "You told me this wasn't about anger anymore. It's about survival. And if this is the war that found you, then it found me too." The room held its breath. Colton met his son's eyes. They were firm, unshaken. "I can handle myself," Owen added. "You know I can." Colton looked down, his thoughts racing. He saw a reflection of himself, not the soldier, but the man who had always wanted to keep his son far from the shadows he lived in. But the war had come anyway. Not with rifles and grenades, but with lies and infiltration. He gave a single nod. "You ride with Vale. You follow every order like your life depends on it, because it will." Owen didn't smile. He just nodded once, solidly. Colton turned back to the board. He ripped down the topmost photo of the Rensford facility, rolled it up, and tucked it into the mission folder. "We don't go to war," he said slowly, the weight of years in every word. "We take their silence away." And with that, the room moved. Quietly, methodically, with the discipline of ghosts. If they wanted to silence warriors, they'd have to answer to a legion. At dawn, the first utility truck rolled past the outer checkpoint of the Blackrest compound. A morning fog clung low over the gravel road, muffling the tires' crunch. The guard on duty stepped out of a small booth, rifle slung lazily over his shoulder, and eyed the vehicle with suspicion. He held up a hand. The truck slowed to a crawl. From the passenger seat, Vale leaned out with a clipboard and a practiced frown. "Waterline check. Emergency call. HQ flagged you for a burst valve on the southern perimeter," he said flatly, tapping a forged maintenance order with a gloved finger. The guard scratched the back of his neck, uncertain. "Didn't hear about that." "Yeah, well," Vale muttered, glancing at his watch. "You'll hear about it in 2 hours when your power shorts and your storage wing floods." "Your call." The guard glanced behind him toward the main building. Another van pulled up behind the first, followed by a third. One of the workers inside yawned loudly. The board performance worked. The guard waved them through. Inside the first truck, Owen sat still beside Vale, his hand clenched around the cold chain of his father's dog tags. He hadn't spoken since they left the safe house. His eyes scanned the perimeter wall, catching the shimmer of motion detectors and a cluster of security cameras mounted above a narrow access gate. No one spoke as the convoy rolled deeper into the compound. Timing was everything. Then came the signal. From a safe house across the county line, Mason Greer patched into the local airband frequency. His voice mimicked a senior regional supervisor perfectly. "Echo 7, be advised, unscheduled fire drill in Training Bay 2. Immediate compliance required. Repeat, training hall evacuation, code red. Inside the compound, 2 guards near the loading dock exchanged confused glances. One of them grabbed his radio. Did you catch that? Yeah, the other muttered, already jogging toward the side entrance. Let's go check it. As the security post fell into brief disarray, Colton's voice cracked over Vale's earpiece. Now! The utility trucks peeled off into staggered positions around the compound's service lanes. Vale reached into a toolkit and pulled out a small black case containing 2 EMP scramblers. He handed one to Owen. Just like we practiced, Vale whispered. In and out. They exited the vehicle quickly, splitting into coordinated pairs. Colton led the first wave through the side gate. Vale and Owen jammed the door's electronic lock, disabling camera feeds within seconds. The compound's exterior lights flickered once, then darkness. Inside, the hallway smelled of dust, sweat, and fresh paint. No training cadets. No sound except the hum of server cooling fans and the click of boots over concrete. Clear, came a whisper over comms. Colton's team moved down the main corridor with practiced silence. Each room they passed revealed more questions than answers. A locker room filled with neatly pressed flight crew uniforms, rows of them, tagged by airline names and sizes. Airline badges, access cards, even custom luggage tags. At first glance it looked like training gear, but Colton knew better. Then they found the weapons. Not guns, not knives, but something worse. Civilian tools transformed into precision instruments of harm. Dozens of sharpened forks identical to the one that had been stabbed into Colton's hand. Pens with metal cores modified to puncture at just the right angle. Syringes rigged to inject without detection. These weren't random items. They were carefully designed to inflict damage in public spaces, airports, flights, conferences, anywhere a soldier might be seen but not expected to bleed. They've been rehearsing this, Owen whispered, horrified. Colton nodded grimly. And not just once. But it wasn't until they reached the far back room that the true purpose of the compound revealed itself. Behind a steel door, Mason's schematics had marked Storage B. Colton and Vale forced it open using a small thermal lance. The hinges screamed softly as the door gave way. Inside, a soft blue glow illuminated rows of data servers and a command console. One wall was covered in printed dossiers, photos, service histories, testimony transcripts, and personal information. Colton stepped closer. His face stared back at him from one of the files. Next to it, General Creed, Colonel Myers, Lieutenant Nash. Names he recognized, men he'd trusted. Each file had the same red stamp across the top. Threat, dignity risk. Colton exhaled slowly. It wasn't just surveillance, it was targeted erasure. These weren't enemies of the state. They were defenders of truth, men who had spoken out against misuse of military power, corruption in defense contracts, or civilian exploitation. What kind of coward labels dignity a threat? Owen murmured, his voice shaking. Colton didn't answer. He pulled out a portable drive from his vest and began copying the database, his movement steady despite the storm inside him. Behind them, Vale's comms crackled. Guards regrouping. We've got 4 minutes tops. Copy, Colton said. We're almost done. Suddenly, the console flashed. An outbound data transmission had just been initiated. Someone else was accessing the files remotely. Colton slammed the cancel key, severing the feed. They know we're here, he muttered. Time to vanish, Vale growled. Owen grabbed a handful of printed dossiers, shoving them into a tactical pouch. Vale activated the signal jammer, frying all wireless feeds in a half-mile radius. Colton gave the order to scatter. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They moved like the ghosts they were trained to be. As they slipped back into the forest shadows beyond the outer wall, the rising sun cast long streaks of gold across the treetops. The compound receded behind them, silent again, but shaken. Colton didn't look back. He carried the hard drive under one arm, the weight of truth heavier than any rifle. They didn't come for blood, they came for proof. The scar never faded. It ran along the ridge of General Colton Rourke's left hand, a jagged, silvery trail that cut through the base of his thumb and disappeared into the flesh below his knuckles. Though the doctors offered to reduce it with treatments, he refused. He never wore gloves to cover it. He never bothered explaining it when strangers stared. That mark had been earned, not in war, but in something far more insidious. Silence. Months had passed since the day Flight 787 was rerouted, since Wyatt Kellum drove a fork through Colton's hand, and since Ghost Lance stormed a compound to uncover the truth buried beneath layers of official lies. But the world had not stood still. The wound had healed, but the mission had not ended. Owen Rourke, once poised to follow his father into military service, sat in the corner of a cluttered apartment office in Iron Ridge City. The glow of his laptop cast shadows across his face as he typed furiously. Beside him, a wall was pinned with printed documents, red string, photographs of military contractors, and one headline in bold, "The Fork That Tried to Silence a General." It had gone live less than 12 hours ago. It was already everywhere. On screen, the comments flooded in. Veterans from across the country shared their stories, small humiliations, quiet threats, unexplained discharges, and under it all, one common thread: Blackrest Solutions. Owen rubbed his temples, overwhelmed but driven. "They were never just trying to hurt you, Dad," he muttered. "They were trying to erase all of you." Across town, Mason Greer stepped off a courthouse stairwell, adjusting the collar of his trench coat. He'd just testified before the Senate Oversight Committee, laying out the evidence Ghost Lance had recovered. With calm precision, he had exposed how Blackrest created covert employee networks, agents embedded into civilian institutions like airlines, hospitals, and even media, to provoke, discredit, or eliminate veterans labeled problematic. It was a quiet war. One fought not with bullets, but with lies. In the weeks after the leak, arrests swept through the upper echelons of Blackrest. Their financial assets, spread across shell corporations and offshore havens, were frozen. Executives were led out of luxury boardrooms in cuffs, their arrogance replaced by confusion. They had never expected to be caught, not by a retired Marine and a disbanded unit they thought forgotten. Wyatt Kellum sat in a federal courtroom, pale and unshaven, as the judge read his sentence. 23 years. No parole. The cameras flashed as he was led away in chains. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the bravado. He didn't look at Colton, who sat in the back row of the gallery, silent, unreadable. He didn't speak when the verdict was delivered. Only his eyes moved, once to the floor, once to the ceiling, and never again toward the man he'd tried to destroy. Later, in a quiet veterans museum on the outskirts of Briar Hill, a small ceremony took place. No cameras, no speeches, just a few men, older, worn but proud, standing around a single glass display case. Inside it lay a bent fork, stained faintly at the tip. The handle still bore the airline's logo. Beneath it, a black plaque with white text read, "He didn't flinch." He fought back Colton didn't attend the unveiling. He arrived alone, days later, well after closing. The curator, a former Navy mechanic, unlocked the door without questions. The general stepped in, the sound of his boots echoing through the empty hall. He walked past exhibits of medals, worn uniforms, and faded photographs until he reached the fork. He stood there for several minutes, hands behind his back, saying nothing. When the curator finally asked, gently, "Would you like a moment alone, sir?" Colton shook his head. "No," he replied quietly. "I'm not here to remember." He stepped closer, his gaze locked on the twisted metal. His left hand rose slightly, scar catching the museum's pale light. He tapped the glass once. Not hard, just enough. He didn't speak again. He turned and walked out without another glance. Not because he needed the reminder, but because others did. Colton stood alone beneath a gray sky, the wind brushing softly against the rows of white headstones at Iron Ridge National Cemetery. His boots pressed into the earth, solid and unmoving, as if anchoring him to the memories that whispered from the soil. Before him lay an empty plot, grass trimmed with military precision, the space untouched yet heavy with purpose. He knelt slowly, gritting his teeth against the tightness in his healing hand, and placed a silver medal gently onto the earth. The medal gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, a silent tribute to the men who had fought beside him and left no one behind to mourn them. Behind him, Owen stood with a camera, quiet and steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment was its own language. Colton straightened and saluted. His hand paused at his brow longer than protocol required, not out of ceremony, but out of debt. A breeze passed through the trees like a distant breath, carrying with it the imagined voices of those lost in forgotten wars and classified missions. Some had died with honors. Others, like the ones meant for this plot, had vanished without ceremony. Colton's chest tightened. He had carried many burdens in his time, but this one, the duty to remember the forgotten, felt the heaviest. As he lowered his salute, his gaze shifted upward toward the Iron Ridge flagpole. The flag flapped half-mast today, but not for anyone whose name the country knew, not for the shadows. Just as they had lived, they were honored quietly. "I told them I'd hold the line," Colton muttered under his breath, voice gravelly, "even when no one else remembered the fight." Owen lowered the camera. "You did," he said softly, stepping beside his father. His voice carried the steadiness of a man who had seen too much to be naive, but still believed in the fight. "And they know it." Colton didn't answer. He just gave a short nod and turned back toward the pathway. Each step felt weighted, not by injury, but by meaning. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, breaking the silence like gunfire in a church. At home, the air felt different, quieter, but no less tense. On the kitchen counter sat a thick envelope with a dark blue seal. Colton peeled it open with his thumb, wincing slightly as his healing wound met the paper's edge. Inside was a letter, crisply typed and formal in tone. It was an invitation to speak at an upcoming National Defense Summit, an event focused not on battlefield tactics, but on something more personal, civilian threats to military dignity. He read it once, then again. His eyes narrowed. Civilian threats. That meant forks. That meant uniforms in disguise. That meant silence wielded like a weapon. He folded the letter once, neatly, and tucked it into his chest pocket. A small smile tugged at the edge of his mouth, but it wasn't one of relief. It was the kind a soldier wore when he spotted movement in the trees and realized the mission wasn't over. On the nearby table lay a hand-drawn map. It was childlike in style, but deliberate in detail, sketched with colored pencils and labeled with bold, careful strokes. It was Owen's. At the top, written in all capital letters, were the words, "Next Truth to Uncover." Colton picked it up. His eyes scanned the markings. A location circled in red, an old name from his past written beside it, and arrows pointing to files they hadn't touched yet. He knew what it meant. Owen wasn't asking for permission. He was drawing a line of battle. Outside, the wind picked up again. Leaves scattered across the porch, carried by a storm that hadn't yet broken. Colton stepped to the threshold of the doorway, staring into the horizon. His fingers tightened around the map, then loosened. In his palm, the page rested like a mission order, unfinished, urgent, waiting. He didn't need orders anymore, but he had something stronger than that. Purpose. He walked forward into the fading light, each step deliberate, each breath steady. He didn't glance back. The world was shifting again and he could feel it, just like he had on that flight. The tension in the air wasn't fear, it was a calling. And in his heart, he already knew the truth. Some men are made for battlefields, others are made for after. For some, war ends when the guns fall silent. For Colton Rourke, it ended with a fork and began again with a purpose. Because even in peace, a warrior finds his war. Moments later, the cabin shook, his troops rose in fury, and the same cruelty was drowned in consequences. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of violence, abuse of authority, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating those in power. Its purpose is to raise awareness about injustice, provoke thought on accountability, and inspire empathy, respect, and responsibility in how people are treated.